Alright, hello guys, and welcome back to this month where we are doing a little bit more casual stuff on past stuff that we've already explored. So for this week we're doing Yu-Gi-Oh! And as you can tell, we're changing the format a little bit. This isn't something I've done before, so hopefully, this is kind of like a test run, but we'll go from there. So essentially, I've watched Yu-Gi-Oh! The anime for a long time, and as a young child I was just happy to get what I can get. So whatever episodes, I'll just watch it and I'll enjoy it. But now that I'm a little older and I have a little bit of perspective, I feel like I'm kind of comfortable now having a preference of what exactly are the better episodes and what is exactly are the better arcs in general. So today I just want to really rank my top 5 favorite arcs within the anime, and from there we can just use this as a platform for discussion of each arc and what I feel are good points and what I feel are bad points and why it went from one to the other. So obviously the Duel Monsters era does have a lot of arcs in general. So what we'll do today is I already kind of limited them to the top 5 and kind of the cream of the crop essentially, and we'll just work off that basis. So we can debate on whether Capsule Monster is better than Yu-Gi-Oh! R, but like at the end of the day, who really cares about that? So yeah, hope you guys are gonna enjoy this, but let's go ahead and start. So first off, at number 5, starting off rather strong, we have Virtual World arc, which is essentially just this is the Noah arc and the Big Five arc, and we have Yugi, Kaiba, and friends all go into this Sword Art Online before Sword Art Online kind of world where they duel and stuff. So I think this has some strengths, and it is at the very least in the top 5, but it does have some weaknesses. So let's talk about some of the strengths. So I think monsters wise, there's actually quite a few decent, well-designed monsters in here. Apart from just Nightmare Penguin, Perfect Machine King, and the Judge. I forget the Judge monster, but whatever. There's a lot of good monsters here. Even Dark Magician Knight, which is like kind of like at the very end of the arc in general, and the Five-Headed Dragon. I think a lot of it does work quite well. I think Noah's deck, especially all the monsters there, are quite good, even though I personally don't really enjoy these biblical kind of theming. I cannot deny that it does look good. So yeah, I think Virtual World on just that basis is miles better than most of the other stuff that aren't within this top 5. Apart from that, I do think it does use its time to actually put the spotlight on a lot of characters that personally I believe are kind of underutilized. So whether it be Taya, Tristan, Duke, all these like side B tier, some would argue probably C tier characters, do get a little bit of time, and at the very least pushes them from being completely irrelevant, and gives them a platform to essentially put their skills on the map, I suppose you could say. But apart from that, I think the positives become harder and harder to find, and we can start talking about this one that's kind of like in the middle zone between good and bad, which is Deck Masters. So Deck Masters, for don't know, are kind of based off of Magic the Gathering's Commanders, which are essentially a monster that you pull out from your deck, and it essentially is like the leader of the deck. So you can use it in ways that are usually less restrictive, but it also has the weakness that if it ends up being destroyed by your opponent, you essentially just lose the duel. So it's your heart and soul, but all the blood gets pumped through the heart, so it is extremely powerful in that very specific moment. So yeah, that's Deck Masters. I don't know, like conceptually it kind of works and it kind of doesn't work. I think it was a fun gimmick at best, but I don't think I've ever met anybody that was like, yeah, we really need to bring back Deck Masters. That's what was winning. And even like in the various fun formats that you could play in real life Yu-Gi-Oh, there's very little times where Deck Masters ever brought up. I think I've seen more Pauper, which is essentially just all commons and only one of each common. I think I'm getting those rules right. Versus, I think I've seen more of those, which is incredibly rare to begin with, over the likes of Deck Master. Like nobody really ever cares about Deck Master, and it's hard to implement, especially in a game that's unbalanced around Deck Masters as Yu-Gi-Oh. Apart from that, there's the villains in general are kind of not really that charismatic. I personally, the Big Five are, you remember them as a concept, but you don't remember them as individuals nor as characters. So, I remember Nightmare Penguin dueling, but I don't remember who exactly Nightmare Penguin is supposed to be. Perfect Machine King, remember him? Now, who's Perfect Machine King? No idea. Stuff like that. At the end of the day, all 5 combine to make the 5-headed dragon. That's cool, but who are these 5? No idea. I don't remember. I'm sure the name was said somewhere, but it's so unmemorable. They're so uncharismatic, and when they're not in like their monster form, which is kind of like when they're not in like Disney mascot costume, you kind of don't remember who exactly they are, which is kind of sad, but that's how it is. And then Noah, which you can see in the picture here, kind of bratty, and he's like kind of not that interesting as a character. He's like if Seto Kaiba never grew up and really annoying, so it's like no, it's just not cool. I think what would have been cool is if he kind of like made a adult version of himself, and then like somehow I think that would have been a cooler transition than just keeping him in this bratty child form. Apart from that, I think in general this arc felt kind of pointless. It came in at a weird time, and it kind of interrupts a better arc that we'll talk about later. And even though they kind of sort of try and twist it so that it fits within the timeline and it vaguely makes sense, it really just doesn't. Like, the premise kind of sucks. The end, at the end where everything gets resolved, it feels like nothing really happened. So yeah, I think Virtual World, it's definitely in the top 5, but it's definitely at number 5, at least in my opinion. And again, this is gonna be subjective. Even the stuff that I say, maybe you think Deckmaster's so good, you put it above all the negatives that maybe you even agree with my negatives, but you just think Deckmaster's so cool, you put it at number 2, 1 or something. I can't control that. If you make your own mistakes. So next, we're gonna move up to number 4. This may be a controversial pick because it is a fan favorite, but at least for me, when I took a little bit of more objective time, it really just wasn't. So number 4 is Duelist Kingdom, and yes, this is the famed first real arc of Yu-Gi-Oh! So by real, I mean this is the one that actually it pretty much just launches Yu-Gi-Oh! Into this card game path, when before it was kind of flip-flopping between other games, other like these for fun games that you play with friends. So yeah, Duelist Kingdom, like I said, it does set the ground rules for the card game, and it introduces a lot of characters that will be important even years down the line. Whether it be Pegasus, it reintroduces Kaiba, I suppose. It introduces Mai, Rex, Weevil, Bandit Keith. Kind of nobody really cares about Bandit Keith after this, really, and like a bunch of pretty important characters, all things said, and at least it does create pretty much the fundamentals of the series as a whole. And it also actually introduces a lot of interesting mechanics that don't always work, but at the time it kind of makes sense. It kind of does make sense, such as like the attributes with weaknesses, kind of like in Pokemon where fire might be less effective against water or stuff like that. It kind of vaguely touches on that, but it kind of gives up at near the end, which probably is for the better, or else it would have made things a lot too complicated. It would have essentially just made it a pain in the ass to balance. But let's talk briefly about like the whole premise, which is essentially Pegasus inviting the greatest duelists around the world. And I really love the tournament structure that it presented. So what you have here is essentially you have to collect star chips, and after a number of star chips well, I guess it's kind of like Pokemon badges. You essentially just keep dueling other people, waging your badges, and once you collect enough badges, you could get into the real event, the main event, and there's like a time limit and stuff like that. So it allowed some really interesting dynamics where, let's say a worse player challenges a better player. The better player almost has like no incentive to play against them. But if the worst player goes like, yeah, if I win, I only want 1 of your chips. If I lose, I'll give you 3 of my chips. At that point, the favorite player has a chance jumpstart, their progress, while the worst player has a chance to actually play with a better player. and stuff like that. It didn't really come up too much, but at least conceptually, it really makes sense to me. And I really like just wagers in general. I like that there's like a consequence to that, and it really feels impactful. Other than that, at the end of it, there is the King of Games title on the line. So with Yugi winning, he actually pretty much receives the King of Games title from Pegasus, and it is a title that will stick along with Yugi throughout his whole career, and it's probably like one of the greatest lines and one of the greatest titles in any sort of anime or media in general. So it's really up there. There's also a lot of pretty good matchups in this arc. There's Yugi versus Kaiba, Kaiba versus Pegasus, Pegasus versus Yugi, Joey versus Yugi, and Pegasus especially I really love as a character. Now, I will say that he doesn't even feel that villainous. He's kind of like this super enigmatic figure, and he's playful, but he's also definitely dark. He has like this dark humor too to him. But at the end of it, even though we can definitely see that he's kind of corrupted by the Millennium Eye and stuff like that, you know, once he actually loses in the duel with Yugi, he, you know, it's everything gets squared off like super quickly. So it doesn't have like this negative and this evil background behind all of it when all is said and done. And even though obviously they play up on like that darkness, even though it is a fan favorite, it obviously does have some weaknesses. So I think we talked about it briefly, but like some of the mechanics being introduced slowly and inconsistently does make a lot of growing pains and makes each duel kind of a little bit hard to understand, like if we just remove it from its space and time and just look at it individually. A lot of the rules just get applied here but don't get applied there, and there's a lot of like made up bullshit rules that kind of come in and out really quickly. And I know you would obviously your argument would say, yeah, this happens in a ton of duels, but yeah, I do think it happens more often here than in other places. So one example of like one of the more bullshitter ones is when Giant Soldier of Stone, I believe is the name of the card, legit just punches the moon, and that just weakens like an enemy monster. And I think that's just like such a stupid, it's so dumb that it's funny, but it's also like if you take a minute, it's actually really dumb, so you have to take off points. Especially with that in mind, even though we can say it introduced a lot of important characters, there's also a lot of matchups here that just ended up being kind of boring and kind of not really necessary in the grand scheme of things. I think the worst one was probably like Joey versus Bonds, which is just like barely entertaining. And even then, when it's like Bonds is not at all going to be an important character. Like even Yugi versus Mako, at least Mako has a repeat performance in like 2-3 seasons down the line, but nobody gives a shit about Bonds. And finally, I think the last thing I would say is that I felt like the final battle didn't really have like the spectacle. So I know it's a trope, you know, every big Hollywood blockbuster should have like the explosion scenes and like the fight scene, right? But and you sure, you know, we're above that here, you know, not everything needs to be like this bombastic light show, but I do think the final of Yugi versus Pegasus, well, I guess I'll use Pharaoh now because I think this will become more important down the line to make a distinction between the two. But I think the Pharaoh versus Pegasus, the two's duel is good, but it also didn't feel like this is the final battle. And sure, you know, once Relinquish comes out, it feels like nastier and it feels a little bit scarier and there's a little bit more tension. But, you know, in the grand scheme of things, this Relinquish is kind of, yeah, it's just there, I guess. So yeah, I think Duelist Kingdom, I think if we're talking about importance-wise, it will probably rank incredibly highly, probably first or second. But I think in terms of just straight-up entertainment and straight-up enjoyment, and you know, these are very subjective factors and subjective characteristics. At least to me, it's just number 4. So yeah, this is where it's gonna land, and that's it for me. At number 3, we have perhaps controversial after all I've said about Duelist Kingdom, Waking the Dragons. So Waking Dragons is a fully filler arc that I think is one of the best filler arcs in just any anime in general. It's really strong for what it is, and it's a really enjoyable watch. There is no read, so it's just an enjoyable watch. So first, let's start with the premise. So we all know that Ancient Egypt plays a vital role for Yu-Gi-Oh! As a series. So What is older than ancient Egypt? Well, ancient Atlantis, with these Atlanteans and this is darts, and the premise is actually so dumb. It actually is kind of funny, and in that sense, kind of gives it a point, which is doesn't really make sense considering what I said about Giant Soldier of Stone, but that's how it is sometimes. All jokes aside, I do think it did introduce some pretty cool monster designs. The legendary dragons being given to Kaiba, Joey, Yugi, and the various fusions that they are used for makes it very interesting. And each one of them has like a different theming. So for example, Yugi pretty much has Tamias having somebody ride on him, while Kaiba has Critias, I believe is the name of his dragon, merge with whatever thing he wants to merge it with. And then Joey, who has Hermos, I believe is his dragon, fuse with one of his monsters, but it always becomes like this weapon. So I like that there's a distinction between the three. It's very original, and most of them have pretty cool designs. Even Hermos, which is probably the least cool of the three, the fact that he makes these like jokey kind of weapons with some of Joey's more jokey characters is super funny, and I really enjoy that. Putting that aside, Waking the Dragons also surprisingly had some of the best duels within the series as a whole, with two of them being a highlight, at least for me. The joke answer would obviously be Valen versus Joey, which was an incredible fist fight between these gentlemen who just understand the art of the duel, with each using their deck to upgrade each other's gear to just keep swinging at each other. It's a fantastic display of Yu-Gi-Oh! At its finest stupidity, and I love it. On the other hand, we have what is probably the correct answer, which is actually Raphael's victory over the Pharaohs. I think this is incredibly well done, especially considering it's the Pharaohs' first true loss within the series. And it actually does tell a mini story within a single duel, with Raphael convincing the Pharaoh and persuading him to use the dark arts of the Seal of the Orichalcos to increase his chances of victory. The Pharaoh eventually slipping and falling for this temptation, and then gets ultimately punished for it, losing the duel, even having such a grand lead, because he forgets and forgoes the things that he cares the most in pursuit of victory. And at the end of it, Raphael comes in, beats him, and is there to claim his soul. But of course, almost one of the greatest scenes ever, Yugi Moto, the original, I guess the original spirit, takes the Pharaoh's place, because he knows deep down that if they want any chance of a comeback, they need the Pharaoh. So Yugi gives himself up. In a different timeline, I guess you could say that maybe Yugi steps up, and it could be good, it could be bad, but at least this time that was chosen, I really love it. It's a great, it's something that if you took a minute to think about, it's like this loophole that really makes sense, and I always appreciate it when we think inside the box and we are able to use the rules in a way that's creative. And Yugi Moto taking the place of the Pharaoh, chef's kiss. Apart from that, I do think there is a lot of really good duels in general. Even apart from those, Yugi going off on Weevil is definitely a highlight for me. Joey going up against Rex, the grudge match culminated pretty nicely. Even Kaiba's few duels, Kaiba probably had the weakest of the three in terms of the matchups that he went up against, but they were still okay. I still enjoy them. Much like for Virtual World, we had deck masters that was kind of like on the good and the bad spectrum. The Seal of Orichalcos is this one's, flip-floppy. So the problem with Seal of Orichalcos, on the one hand, it's definitely like a very lazy way to create power creep in some sense. So it's like, let's say you're actually, you're fine with Seal of Orichalcos as is, but it kind of puts it in the back of your mind. You just think, what are the Sword Riders going to do? Are they going to introduce a card that raises all monsters attack by 700? 700 now instead of the 500. It just feels like a very lazy way to make the opponents scary, or the opponents terrifying, or that kind of thing. It's really weak. However, I think, considering all that, the way that they actually used that concept, the Seal of Orichalcos, was throughout the, from the beginning. It's kind of like this tool that they use to make the odds uneven and in the villains' favor. But later on, they actually use it as a story device, and with the eventual usage to to fool and then to beat the Pharaoh. I think that makes up for any one of my complaints that I had with the Silver Orichalcos, which is why, unlike Deckmaster kind of pushing down Virtual World, for me, the Silver Orichalcos actually pushes it up. And it's like this super iconic card, and it's super iconic and recognizable, mainly because it probably actually is a real life symbol that I don't know enough about to make a strong statement here. But even though I'm okay with Silver Orichalcos, there are some other problems with Waking the Dragon. So first, the picture that we have to represent Waking the Dragon is Darts here. He's really evil McEvil. If we're being honest, he's extremely evil, and like if he actually took a moment, it's like some villains have like these noble ideals, but that they achieve their ideals using dark methods. But like if Darts just took a minute to listen to what he was saying, he's like, yeah, we need to capture souls to release the Leviathan. It's like, okay, what does the Leviathan do? Like, what do you need him? He will destroy everything. Okay, like what's the point of destroying everything? Like, we never really understand. His goals seem to be reviving Atlantis and raising it up, but why does it necessarily need to be the Leviathan? It doesn't really make sense to me. And at the end of the day, it felt very... So, unlike, for example, the guy under him, Pegasus, which felt like flip-floppy in terms of whether or not I feel like he's a villain, Darth is so stereotypically and comedically and like almost a caricature of somebody who is evil. Just feels weird. It just feels like a very weak character in general. It's so bad that it's bad. Even though I have mainly complimented, Timaeus, Critias, and Hermos, I do think the vagary of a lot of the cards and a lot of the monsters introduced within this arc kind of hurts the series, kind of hurts the season. So, for example, like at least once for each of the three players with the three duelists with the legendary dragons, they took a minute to like, what does this do? I have no idea. Let's find out. Like that's not compelling, right? It's like it doesn't really make our duelists sound like admirable and like intelligent or anything. It just feels like it's a gamble. It's essentially just time wizarding each time. And time wizard cool the first few times, but like if Joey had to win every duel because of time wizard, that's just not it, friend. And I will say, even though I have mainly had complaints for Darts, I do think the three henchmen with Valen and Raphael and the last one whose name I forget were pretty decent villains. Even the one whose name I forget, I think he's essentially just a better Noah, since the two have kind of similar motivations to wanting to take down Kaipa. But Valen is a really good nemesis and mirror image, I suppose, in some sense, of Joey. While Raphael is stoic, but also feels noble, and it feels like the things that he says make sense. And because I actually quite like these characters, why this is actually a negative is because I personally feel like we kind of gave up on these characters really quickly. Maybe because this is, at the end of the day, a filler arc. It feels like they didn't really give it enough time. I felt like Raphael especially, he went from beating Yugi, closely losing to Yugi, then just getting one shot by Darts. Like, I feel like there could have been like a build up there. Valen had a good limelight. I'm actually rather happy with that one. It would have had maybe a minute more of closure would have been helpful. And the last one, whose name I forget, that's probably the weakest of the three. But essentially, I do think those three in general are pretty good. And if it was more opportunity was given to them instead of just so quickly being thrown to the side, it would have been better. So that's why, all in all, Waking the Dragon, I personally really enjoyed it. And I will go back and watch that Joey versus Valen fight at least once a year. Moving on to number 2. And even though you guys don't see my top 5, I think if you take a minute and you just speculate, it's not that hard to guess what the top 5 best arcs were. Ignoring the order is, obviously subjective, but I think most people would agree what the top 5 is. So number 2 is Millennium World. I think you might also know it as either Dawn of the Duel or just simply the Ancient Egypt arc. So this one, with Yu-Gi-Oh being so Egyptian heavy, Egyptian theme heavy, Ancient Egypt heavy, even though it's probably, I haven't studied Ancient Egypt enough to know what the accuracy rate is for all this, but it's very thematically Ancient Egyptian. So this one is definitely the most Ancient Egypt of all Ancient Egypt possibilities, because we go back in time, we have the pharaoh relive parts of his life in this Back to the Future-esque kind of thing, where it gives us a lot of lore and background context to some decently important stuff, such as why Kaiba and Blue Eye seem to be so interlinked. There's a lot of large-scale fights in this arc, especially, and I really enjoy the way they portray a lot of the larger, bigger-than-life kind of characters like Obelisk, Ra, the Egyptian gods. Cypher, obviously, those three need to be there because they're Egyptian gods. But even Obelisk, when Obelisk shows up, being pulled by whoever is like old grandpa, ancient grandpa, that was awesome too. Apart from that, it does bring back what is potentially like the first true villain of the series in the form of Bakura. And Bakura is this it's like this in between Pegasus and Darts, and I really do appreciate that. He's conniving, but even though his plans on paper don't seem as large as Darts is, if we think of what Darts did, but it feels sinister. So I kind of like Bakura. He's like a decent middle point, and all the Millennium items look dope. So anybody who has one is usually pretty cool. So which is why I think I like Pegasus more than Darts. Well, Darts is just shit. So that's not a fair example. But Pegasus, Millennium Eye, awesome. And Bakura Millennium Necklace, I think that's Necklace. Is it Necklace or what's the other one? Millennium Pendant? One of the two. That's also super cool. And I think what is finally the highlight of this arc in general, and I would kind of cheat and put what I'm going to talk about into this. I know some people would argue it's not in this, but I feel it is for me, which is the final goodbye duel between Yugi and the Pharaoh. So this is just beautifully scripted. It's incredibly well done. It revisits a lot of the old the best monsters from the repertoire of the Pharaoh and the repertoire of Yugi. It pretty much is essentially the equivalent of like the last episode of mech animes, when like the pilot just gets out of the mech and he's like, "Yep, I don't need you anymore, old friend," and that's essentially just this farewell. It's incredibly well done. It shows that Yugi has grown to not need the Pharaoh. Obviously he would like to have the Pharaoh stick around, but he doesn't need him anymore, because he is on par, at least in dueling. Yeah, and even though some of the details here are kind of thrown away when Dark Side of Dimensions comes out, it's still an incredible send off to an insane story. So yeah, I really have a lot of respect for Dawn of the Duel. It's definitely up there. I do think, as a fan of the card game, it didn't have as much as some of the others, but overall it serves its purpose, and I think the farewell duel is possibly in the top 3 duels within the series. Moving on to the negatives, first off, even though Bakura's alright, I do think Zork just straight up sucks. He's super boring. The powers are just generic, and at the end of the day, he just becomes like this large demonic being, and it kind of gets boring. I didn't really enjoy it, and I don't really know anybody who actually goes out of their way to say that they actually enjoy Zork. So yeah, Zork's just not it. I'd rather it just be Bakura, and honestly, I know evil gods are something within the manga. And I would have preferred that instead of Zork, man. Zork is just bad. Apart from that, I do think the story here you do actually need to pay attention. Like, your brain kind of needs to be turned on for a lot of this, because there's a lot of weird cuts backs, weird cuts forwards, weird cuts to the left, weird cuts to the right, and the story is kind of pieced together kind of weirdly, and it makes like what is originally a kind of complex manga plot into a semi coherent anime story. So it's rough. You do need to give it do need to be aware of some of the stuff that's happening, and those who watch it for the first time might not really enjoy all that it could be, because there's just the places it brings you, sometimes it keeps going on with the tour without making sure that you're following along. But still, that solidly puts Dawn of the Duel, at least for me, at number 2. So even though you guys don't see the list, I think most people will agree on number 1, or I hope most people will agree, which is indeed Battle City. So Battle City is what I believe to be the greatest arc within at least Duel Monsters era of Yu-Gi-Oh! So Battle City, even though it's not the first card game arc, because Duelist Kingdom has that privilege, I do think that while Duelist Kingdom laid the foundation of how the game is played, I think Battle City kind of refined what the game will become. So a lot of the rules put forward will be adopted as like standard rules within all future anime series and anime episodes. So Battle City is incredible. It has incredible matchups between some of our favorite characters, which is really just great. It has Merrick versus Mai, Merrick versus Joey, Yugi versus Kaiba, Yugi versus Merrick, and it introduces for the first time the Egyptian gods, and these have been hyped up, and the Egyptian gods really delivered, whether it be Slifer for the first time showing up at the hands of strings, and at least to me, I can just close my eyes and picture the pharaoh within that, I think it's called Cage of Nightmares, and then there's the Slifer staring down at him. That's like a fantastic scene. Even Obelisk showing up for the first time. I think Obelisk one-to-one is probably like the least bombastic and least like flashy of the three, but it's still like a dope look, and when it's swinging, it looks like it really just is getting ready to knock your head out. So yeah, it's a good looking lad. And then we have Ra, and I think Ra peaks in Battle City. Like, you will never see Ra in a better form. Even in the Ancient Egypt arc, when he's like just flying around freely, I think he looks less cool than in this Battle City for the first time. Whether it be his sphere mode, whether it be his regular mode, or whether it be his Firebird mode, all three just look great. The Egyptian gods were hyped up and they delivered, which is the best feeling ever. And I did mention Joey a few times. Even if we look away from Yugi and Kaiba, I think Joey also had some of his best moments here, with the highlight definitely being his matchup versus Merrick. And Merrick was actually sweating until Joey just had to give out, which was a fantastic turn in terms of his character growth. He had, he was even allowed into the tournament to begin with until some bullshit happened and pretty much he sneaked in, quote unquote. But he definitely grew to be like a top 4 duelist, and I think the journey has been worth it. He played like a real duelist, and I really respect that. I think a lot of the things that I liked about Duelist Kingdom's tournament structure also came back here. So even though the star system then is non-existent, instead they pretty much each player wager cards, and after you collect enough quote unquote rare cards, you get the right to move on. And I really like this. It's the same way that I like that there's like, it feels like there's consequences. So, and it also allows some of the most iconic cards to fall into our characters' hands. Especially, I would think the most iconic one would be like Joey's Jinzo that he won off the Psychic dude. So yeah, I think it's a well done tournament, and this was a fun just premise for everything. It made sense, and even without Merrick coming in and creating chaos, I do think it would have been a fun standalone thing, and it's a well-designed tournament that's easy to understand and easy to enjoy. And speaking of Merrick, Merrick's a pretty good villain. I think he's not necessarily like the best the one with the greatest plan, but he's like ominous when he's first shadowy, and then when he actually goes into gets revealed, he's like cold and calculated, and then when he goes Yami Merrick mode, he's kind of like out of control. You can the way the voice modulation works, and there's like echoes. It really works. It really works, and I kind of makes him seem like insane and unhinged in some sense. And there's like a twinning effect, which makes sense in the context of everything. And I think the fact that Merrick's like a decent villain kind of makes Bakura later down the line more interesting. So we kind of need Merrick for Bakura to work, if that makes sense. And yeah, so for the most part, Battle City is fantastic. It solidified the rules. It's a great tournament structure. Provided many good matchups. And yeah, overall enjoyable. Great visuals and stuff like that too. You know, it is my number one, so it's my sweetheart season, but even I still recognize some of the problems. So first, we talked about it earlier, but Virtual World does come in and kind of interrupt the flow. And even though, like I said, they do kind of twist things around to kind of make the puzzle piece fit, it still doesn't fit neatly, in my opinion. It just comes in and out, and it kind of just feels like something happened, but you know, we're not sure why exactly this happened. But essentially what it did is that it kind of just killed the tempo. There's like a build up, and sure, you might say Virtual World was good enough that it was kind of worth it, but in my opinion, it kind of wasn't. Like I'd rather have something else, but it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I mean, I am glad that Virtual World does exist, I suppose. On the other hand, even though there are a lot of great matchups, there is a few like kind of boring matchups, like Odeon versus Joey. That was kind of boring. Shizu versus Kaiba, kind of boring. A controversial one maybe. Loomis plus Umbra versus Kaiba plus Yugi. You know, on paper it sounds fun because you have Kaiba and Yugi working together, but honestly, it's kind of whatever, man. Like it was alright, I guess. And like the Curse of Beast is, it's whatever. And with that, I think that's about it. Like I said, this is still probably my favorite arc, and I think many people might share the opinion, maybe. But if not, go ahead and tell me why. Maybe you would convince me that, you know, perhaps actually all of these suck and Capsule Monsters is the best. So, you know, at that point, who am I to argue? With that, I hope you guys enjoyed. This is definitely a departure away from the format. I'm probably not ever gonna use this format because it has felt kind of weird to use it this entire time. But yeah, you know, it's good to try and step out of the box and try things out. So let's see where this goes. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe, or whatever you like. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed, and see you next time, dummies.